Alexander Konstantinovich Glazunov was born on August 10, 1865 in St. Petersburg, Russia. His father Konstantin was a book publisher, while his mother Elena was a pianist. He also had a younger brother named Dmitry, who was an entomologist. The Glazunov family was a relatively well-known bookselling firm in Tsarist Russia and were granted hereditary nobility in 1882. As for Alexander, he had a very good ear and a phenomenal musical memory. He began studying the piano at age 9 and composing at age 11. Alexander's talent was recognized by composer Mily Balakirev, a member of the Five. Balakirev showed his work to Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, with Rimsky-Korsakov recalling, quote, "Casually, Balakirev once brought me the composition of a 14 or 15-year-old high school student, Alexander Glazunov. It was an orchestral score written in childish fashion. The boy's talent was indubitably clear." Alexander would meet Rimsky-Korsakov in late 1879, the latter arranging for one of his works to be performed 3 years later. This performance was praised by composer Alexander Bordin and music critic Vladimir Stasov. Alexander then began studying under Rimsky-Korsakov, who claimed that Alexander's musical development progressed, quote, "not by the day, but literally by the hour." Apparently, Alexander finished a curriculum designed to be 5 to 7 years long in just 1.5 years. Rimsky-Korsakov considered Alexander more of a junior colleague rather than just another student. Russian composer Anatoly Lyadov would then introduce Alexander's music to philanthropist and music critic Mitrofan Belyayev. Belyayev took an interest in the young Alexander and took him on a trip throughout Western Europe. While in Weimar, Germany, Alexander would meet the late Franz Liszt. His first symphony was also performed while in Weimar. Belyayev then rented out a concert hall and hired an orchestra to perform Alexander's first symphony, as well as the Suite Charakteristique. The following season, Belyayev would give a public concert of Alexander's works, which eventually evolved into the Russian Symphony Concerts. Belyayev would then start his own publishing house in Leipzig in 1885, which initially published works by those previously mentioned and led to the creation of the Belyayev Circle. After the death of Borodin in 1887, Glazunov and Rimsky-Korsakov would work together to complete his opera Prince Igor and his Third Symphony. Glazunov's phenomenal memory allowed him to fully restore the overture to the opera, which he'd heard played by Borodin on the piano shortly before he died. He would also entirely orchestrate the Third Symphony. As for his own works, Glazunov conducted his Second Symphony in Paris in 1889 and wrote his Third Symphony in 1890. The third was dedicated to the late Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, whom he had maintained a correspondence with. Tchaikovsky even invited Glazunov to preliminary auditions for Souvenir de Florence in 1890. Glazunov then wrote 2 more symphonies and his ballet Raymonde. Despite going through a creative crisis into 1891, Glazunov would become internationally famous. He was appointed the conductor of the aforementioned Russian Symphony Concerts in 1896. He would conduct the premiere of Tchaikovsky's The Storm, as well as the infamously disastrous premiere of Sergei Rachmaninoff's First Symphony. Glazunov's wife would later claim that her husband was drunk during the latter premiere, though this hasn't been confirmed. While Glazunov loved to conduct, he never got around to mastering it. He would jokingly say, quote, "You can criticize my compositions, but you can't deny that I am a good conductor and a remarkable conservatory director." He would also write his Sixth Symphony during this time. Glazunov became a professor at St. Petersburg Conservatory in 1899. Some of his students included violinist Nathan Milstein and most famously composer Dmitri Shostakovich. Glazunov would hold his position until 1905, when he left in protest after Rimsky-Korsakov was fired for supporting students who supported the First Russian Revolution. About a month later, Rimsky-Korsakov was rehired and Glazunov became the director of the conservatory, which he held for 25 years. During his tenure at the conservatory, Glazunov would write his 7th and 8th symphonies in 1902 and 1905 respectively, and his Violin Concerto in 1904. He then conducted the last of the Russian Symphony Concerts in 1907, and received 2 honorary doctorates from the universities of Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. Glazunov then wrote the first movement of his 9th Symphony in 1910, but left the work unfinished. However, his duties at the conservatory and possibly his heavy drinking slowed down his output. Glazunov also faced hardships during World War I and the Russian Civil War, but continued composing and conducting. He would conduct in factories, clubs, and for units of the Red Army. In 1915, he wrote Paraphrase on the Hymns of the Allies, which combined numerous anthems from Allied nations. A magazine would call the piece a, quote, conglomerate of hymns and not a creative impulse corresponding to the historical moment. He then conducted the premiere of his second piano concerto in Petrograd in 1917. Glazunov played an extremely important role in the reorganization of the Petrograd Conservatory. He improved the curriculum, raised standards for students and staff, and defended the autonomy of the conservatory. He would even personally attend his students' exams and write down notes for each of them. The conservatory received special status among higher learning institutions following the October Revolution. which happened in November, Glazunov established a good relationship with the Bolsheviks, and especially with the Minister of Education, Anatoly Lunacharsky. He was even awarded the People's Artist of the RSFSR in 1922. Despite this, many in the conservatory would attack Glazunov for his conservatism, with professors demanding more progressive methods and students demanding more rights. Glazunov saw these demands as destructive and unjust. In 1928, he took advantage of an opportunity to go to Vienna for the 100th anniversary of the death of Franz Schubert. Glazunov never returned to the Soviet Union. Maximilian Steinberg, who was the son-in-law of Rimsky-Korsakov, ran the Leningrad Conservatory in Glazunov's absence until Glazunov officially resigned in 1930. Before leaving for the West, Glazunov played an important role in the Russian observation of the 100th anniversary of the death of Ludwig van Beethoven in 1927. He then gave his first public concert after leaving the Soviet Union in 1928, conducting his second piano concerto, his Overture Solennelle, Stenka Razin, and his Seventh Symphony. He continued conducting across Europe and the US, conducted a recording of his ballet The Seasons, and eventually settled in Paris. Glazunov claimed that he left the Soviet Union due to health reasons, which allowed him to remain a respected composer in the Soviet Union, unlike some others. In 1929, at age 64, Glazunov married Olga Gavrilova. Her daughter Elena was a pianist who was a soloist in the Paris premiere of Glazunov's second piano concerto. He then adopted Elena, and her husband managed Glazunov's professional affairs in Paris. One of the last pieces Glazunov wrote was his saxophone concerto in 1934. It premiered in New Schopling, Sweden, with German saxophonist Sigurd Rache as the soloist. On March 21, 1936, Glazunov died in a clinic just outside of Paris. More than 35 years after his death, his remains were reinterred to Tikhvin Cemetery at the Alexander Nevsky Lavra in Leningrad. Glazunov's early style was much more nationalistic. His first two symphonies in particular epitomize this. By the time his career started taking off, he no longer saw any validity in the debate between an academic approach and a nationalistic approach. He began writing in a more sophisticated and lyrical style. According to musician and writer Andrew Huth, Glazunov's Fourth Symphony was written in a deliberately cosmopolitan style from the perspective of a Russian looking towards the West, though the piece was still quite Russian in tone. Glazunov continued to fuse nationalism and Western techniques in his Fifth Symphony. One interesting thing about Glazunov would have to be his relationship with composer Igor Stravinsky. Towards the beginning of his career, Stravinsky admired Glazunov for his musical form, purity, and assurance in his writing. However, Stravinsky would eventually claim Glazunov was one of the most disagreeable men he had ever met. Glazunov, in return, didn't support Stravinsky's more modernist style, a sentiment shared by Rimsky-Korsakov, who had also taught Stravinsky. According to British musicologist Stephen Walsh in his book Stravinsky, A Creative Spring, Russia and France, 1882 to 1934, Glazunov may have been more indifferent towards Stravinsky. However, British musicologist Eric Walter White argues that Glazunov was much more hostile towards Stravinsky's music when around other people. He reportedly said Stravinsky's piece Feu d'Artifice had, quote, no talent, just dissonance. This led to Stravinsky being commissioned by the Ballet Russe founder Sergei Diaghilev. Glazunov also told leader of the Imperial Theaters of Russia, Vladimir Telyakhovsky, quote, Petrushka is not music, but is excellently and skillfully orchestrated. Other interesting facts about Glazunov include him being featured on a 2-ruble coin issued in 2015. He has an Antarctic glacier named after him, and according to Shostakovich, he had a bottle of alcohol hidden behind his desk that he would drink through a tube. Now that I believe.